Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Donald Muller. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator for today's session. We do have quite a full agenda for you today, as you'll see from our slides. If we could just see the agenda slide, please. Quite a full agenda with a number of speakers who are going to be covering topics such as the pathways to dairy net zero, the dairy sustainability framework, and also the work that's gone on with Dairy Nourishes Africa. We do have several dignitaries who are going to welcome us and share some opening remarks at the beginning as well. Some light housekeeping before we get going. The event is being recorded and will be available on Global Dairy Platform's YouTube channel afterwards for you to share it with your colleagues. We invite you also to use the Q&A function throughout to put forward any questions that you might have. You also have the option to raise your hand, and as of now, you're all muted, but we will activate your microphone if you wish to take the floor during the Q&A session, which will happen towards the end of the speakers' presentations today. Today's event will demonstrate how the dairy sector identifies innovative approaches to promote sustainable recovery from both COVID-19 and also to accelerate action towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We look forward to hearing from our distinguished panelists and to having a productive session. And firstly, we're honored to share with you a pre-recorded statement from His Excellency Colleen Kilapale, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Botswana to the United Nations and the 77th President of the Economic and Social Council. Ambassador Kilapale was elected the 77th President on July 23rd, 2021. He has an accumulated career of over 26 years in multilateral diplomacy, both as a government representative, intergovernmental expert, and also as a former United Nations Secretariat staff member. Before his appointment in 2018 as the Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the UN in New York, he was the Chief of Staff to the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia from 2014 to 2018. If we could please play the recording of Ambassador Kilapale.
First and foremost, I would like to thank profoundly Global Dairy Platform, GDP, for hosting this important side event on driving Sustainable Development Goal, SDG implementation through dairy, and for inviting me to deliver some remarks. Dairy has always been and continues to be a major force for good in the world. The dairy sector supports economic growth and builds strong, resilient, enduring economies and can transform the lives of individuals, families, and communities. Dairy provides vital, affordable nutrition for 6 billion people globally. In fact, dairy provides 10% of the world's protein, a high-quality protein. Additionally, 1 billion people rely on the dairy sector for their livelihoods, while another 600 million people live on dairy farms, and 400 million rely on the full-time jobs that support the dairy industry. Excellencies, the dairy sector is also an important partner in the empowerment of women, including in some of the poorest parts of the world. There are an estimated 356 million dairy cows or buffaloes in the world, but you will be interested to know that the average head size is approximately 3 cows. Currently, there are 133 million dairy farms worldwide, 37 million of which are led by women, and while dairy provides 240 million full-time jobs, 80 million of these are held by women. In my own country, Botswana, Global Dairy Platform has been an important partner in our economic development and in the provision of livelihoods and nutrition in our efforts towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Initiatives such as Pathways to Dairy Net Zero and the Dairy Nourishes Africa are important and timely initiatives which demonstrate the resilience of the dairy sector in building back from the COVID-19 pandemic and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Additionally, the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero is an important step in the reduction of methane and other greenhouse gases from the dairy sector, as this is important for the success of the livestock sector in meeting global expectations. In conclusion, I wish to commend the Global Dairy Platform and its partners for adopting innovative approaches to promote sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and to accelerate action towards the achievement of the SDGs. At national level, Botswana will continue to be a trusted partner with you in this regard. I thank you for your kind attention.
And thank you especially to the Ambassador and Permanent Representative from Mission for Botswana for those comments. Our next speaker, we had planned to hear from Her Excellency, the Ambassador Kinyugu from the Mission for the Republic of Kenya to the United Nations. Unfortunately, Her Excellency is not feeling so well today, and so instead, Kenya's Head of Mission, Mr. Joseph Masila, will be representing her today in our session. Mr. Masila is a minister at the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Kenya to the United Nations, currently responsible for the 5th committee, which deals with the administrative and budgetary matters of the United Nations. Mr. Masila is an economist by profession with over 25 years of progressive public experience. He has wide experience and expertise in areas of economic development, planning, public policy analysis, strategic planning, performance management, results-based management, project planning, and management in the public sector. He's also a balanced scorecard practitioner. So, Mr. Masila, it is our pleasure to welcome you to the floor today.
Thank you very much, Donat, and good morning, everyone. Happy to see you this early morning. Always very refreshing when you have early morning meeting. First and foremost, yes, as moderator said, is that Ambassador Jambi was to grace this occasion, and apparently she's not well, and she requested I step in for her. But nonetheless, I'm happy to come in here and have a small statement which I'll just read through. First and foremost, I take this opportunity to thank Global Dairy Platform for organizing this very important side event. And of course, we appreciate your work in Kenya. Kenya's dairy industry is among the most critical enterprises in the livestock subsector, whose importance is key to contributing to attainment of our national development goals. The industry is the single largest agricultural subsector that contributes about 14% of our GDP and 4% of our national GDP. It is dominated by smallholders who produce slightly over 80% of the domestic milk and sell milk directly to through over 2,000 cooperatives to consumers. As a source of livelihood, the industry provides support to over 1.8 million dairy farming households, an additional 700,000 jobs along the value chain. The government of Kenya attaches very important importance to the industry and has developed several policy instruments that are well aligned to the SDGs, including SDG 1, which is SDG on ending poverty, SDG number 2, which is the SDG on ending hunger in all its forms, and SDG number 15, that is on climate change. These policy instruments aim to improve the productivity and competitiveness of dairy products, increase domestic production, consumption of milk and milk products, transform the dairy industry into a net exporter to the regional and global markets, and reorient milk processing towards long life dairy products. Colleagues, the industry, however, continue to be faced with several challenges, especially in developing countries. Agricultural sectors in these countries have heavily relied on rain-fed model to feed production and supply. As such, they are highly vulnerable to climate change, and more recently, the emerging threats such as COVID-19 pandemic. In Kenya, despite the continued negative impact of climate change on the dairy industry, the Dairy Development Policy, which was developed in 2013, has identified the industry as a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and environmental degradation. Despite the comparative lower emissions, the government of Kenya has committed to fulfill its international obligation by setting that 2% emission reduction target for its estimated greenhouse gases emissions by 2030. The industry has been identified as potential subsector to contribute to the emission reduction target. In that regard, the Kenya NDC aimed to reduce dairy industry gas emissions by 59% below the BAU scenario by 2030. We have also developed an initiative dubbed Dairy Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions, or NAMA, that seek to transform the industry towards a low carbon and climate resilience development pathway. The full implementation of the initiative will increase the per capita consumption, better incomes to dairy value chain actors, enhance equitable employment opportunities, and better emissions abatement that thus positively contribute to sustainable development goals, including SDG 1, 2, 3, 13, and 15. Ladies and gentlemen, to ensure that the industry realizes its full potential, especially towards promoting sustainable recovery from the pandemic and the achievement of SDGs, particularly in developing countries, there is need to ensure accessibility to finance and invest in the technology, innovation, data, and capacity building. This will ensure proper funding of the programs and contribute to increased agricultural outputs, as well as spur value addition and agro-processing. In conclusion, with my remark, just to say that there is need for robust science-based research and data with institutions and researchers from developing countries to build local capacities, knowledge, and expertise. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Moderator, back to you.
Thank you very much for your comments this morning, Mr. Masila. And if you wouldn't mind, please pass our best wishes on to Her Excellency and tell her that we hope she's feeling better soon. Kenya has been an incredible partner to the dairy sector, and we thank you for that. In fact, Kenya will probably get mentioned through all of the subsequent talks, given that you're involved in Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, the Dairy Sustainability Framework, and also in the Dairy Nourishes Africa program. So we thank you for that. And I also would like to recognize the leadership of the president of ECOSOC from Botswana, and also for our colleagues from Kenya, as two countries that continually raise the importance of the role of livestock agriculture with their colleagues across the UN to make sure that people understand the vital role that livestock plays, both in emerging dairy nations or emerging economies, but also more generally in the world as a whole. So we thank you very much for your comments. And as I said, wish our best wishes to Her Excellency.
Sure, thank you very much. Best of luck.
Thank you, thank you. I'd now like to provide an overview of the dairy sector's groundbreaking climate initiative, Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. I will attempt to share my screen and hopefully that will work. Have I managed to share the right screen? Good, I'm seeing nods from a few people, so thank you for that. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning and to talk about the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative. And I thought I'd start off by sharing a little bit of history and background to this program. As a dairy sector, sustainability is not something that we have come to recently. In fact, the dairy sector launched in 2013 in Yokohama, Japan, during the IDF World Dairy Summit, launched the Dairy Sustainability Framework. That's 10 years ago today, almost. It tracks the vital role that dairy plays from both a social, economic, and environmental perspective. And my colleague, Brian Lindsey, who is speaking later on this morning, will give you a lot more detail about the Dairy Sustainability Framework. Suffice to say that today, after 10 years of operation, we now have somewhere around about 240 billion litres of milk reporting through the Dairy Sustainability Framework. That's a little over 30% of the global milk production in the world, and it equates to nearly 50% of the formal milk that is produced in the world. Through the Dairy Sustainability Framework, every year we produce a report, and this is a copy of last year's report. I don't expect you to be able to read it on the screen, but we produce quite a detailed report of all the indicators that we're tracking globally for sustainability. And the reason I wanted to share this with you was to show you one element in particular in that report, and that is the priority that is being placed on the key indicators that are being tracked within the sustainability framework. And you'll notice that the single highest prioritized item in the dairy sector globally is around greenhouse gas emissions. And so that has the highest ranking across the dairy sector. And that led us in 2019 to work with the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization to produce this important report that looked at the impact of climate change and the global dairy cattle sector. That report covered a 10-year period from 2005 to 2010 to 2015. So across that 10-year span, there were 3 data points that we analyzed. And in that time period, the emission intensity of dairy reduced by 11%. Now that means that the amount of greenhouse gas produced per kilogram of milk reduced by 11% globally, and it reduced in all regions around the world. However, at the same time, milk production increased by some 30%. And that 30% increase in milk production meant that we did have an increase in absolute emissions from the dairy sector of around 18%. And the FAO noted that if the dairy sector hadn't made the advances it had, then that emission may have gone up by as much as 38%. So there was some good news in the report in terms of intensity coming down, but really a recognition that as a dairy sector, we also needed to address the challenge of absolute emissions. That led us in the last year and a half to work on this strategy, which we now call Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. And the Global Dairy Platform is delighted to be collaborating with the International Dairy Federation, with the International Livestock Research Institute, the Dairy Sustainability Framework, SAI Platform, and the IFCN Dairy Research Network. So those 6 organizations have come together and they drive the strategy behind Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. We're also delighted to be working with the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, who are our knowledge partner in this initiative. And we'll hear shortly from Richard Dewhurst, who's one of the leads in the GRA on livestock. So Richard, thank you for joining us today. We're also very ably supported by FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization. And shortly after this slide was developed, we also signed a partnership agreement between Global Dairy Platform and FAO to support us in this work. The objectives of the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative are fairly straightforward. We ultimately want to see a reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions in an absolute perspective across the dairy world. But it's important that we recognize that dairy is not just about emissions. Dairy is a very important commodity, as we heard from His Excellency from Botswana. It is the world's largest agricultural commodity by value, 3rd largest by volume, and it is responsible for producing significant amounts of nutrition, which are really, really important in the world today. And I think many of us will attend immediately after this session the launch of this year's SOFI report, where we hear about the state of food insecurity in the world. And so dairy is important for many different reasons. And we need to recognize that when we start to tackle an issue like emissions reduction, that we need to be careful that we don't create a bigger problem in food and nutrition security, livelihoods and economic growth, animal health and welfare, or other areas of climate and natural resource use. We need to be careful that we don't create a problem in one other element while we try and address this question of emissions from dairy sector. We also need to recognize that there is not one dairy system in the world, and this is something that Richard will touch on when he talks about the research that's going on behind this. How do we identify those different farm system topologies around the world, the different farming systems, and make sure that we develop pathways for each of those systems to reduce the emissions that are coming from that particular farm system. And then ultimately, we want to stimulate action right across the dairy world. It's important that we recognize that some 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy sector are coming not just from those large dairy producing nations, but also from emerging dairy economies. And how do we help those economies to start to address reductions in emissions as well? The initiative was launched just during the Food Systems Summit last year, and we did hold a major side event during COP26, where we talked about the plans that we as a dairy sector have for tackling climate change and tackling emissions reduction. At COP27 this year, we intend to give an update on the progress we're making. And at COP28, we want to share the results from some of our initial activity. We already have a significant number of organizations who have signed on to Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, including a number of countries' governments, and we thank them for their support. There's over 100 organizations who have already signed on to Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. But if for some reason you don't see your name on that list, there is still plenty of room for us to add more names. And indeed, it's a relatively simple process. If you visit the website, and I'll give you the address at the end of this presentation, you can sign up to be a supporter for Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. Before I hand over to Richard, I did want to just point out that we have a very active work program going on at the moment. Richard's going to talk about the area on the left-hand side of the screen, which is really about the research, the analysis, the methods and tools that are going on. I wanted to touch briefly on the right-hand side, which is how are we executing and how will we deliver the results from this. And in that area, there are two major points of emphasis for us. Firstly is in those already developed dairy economies. I'm thinking here Western Europe, North America, Oceania, etc. One of the things we need to do is we need to enumerate the progress that's already been made. So how do we understand the progress that's been made in those markets and communicate that better? At the same time, we need to identify and engage with those key emerging dairy nations, as I mentioned before. And to do that, we've been working to prepare concept notes to be sent to the Green Climate Fund for funding. And I'll share in a moment with you the countries that we're talking about there. And as I mentioned before, during COP27, we want to be in a position to share an update on the progress that's being made. From the emerging dairy economies perspective, we've been working very closely with the Global Methane Pledge. Now, I think many of you will know, I think there's now 113 countries who've signed on to the Global Methane Pledge. And when you look at the countries who've signed that, you'll notice that for many of them, agriculture is going to be the significant source of emissions from that economy. And therefore, we as an agricultural sector need to understand how we can work with those countries to help reduce their emissions. Countries that we have identified, we've identified a list of 10 countries, which between them represent around 30% of the emissions from the dairy sector globally. We've been working with the United States government to reach out to those countries. In fact, we've now sent letters to 8 of them, 8 of the initial 10, and we're making good progress with them as well in terms of identifying how we can work with them to tackle their emissions. This is the list of countries that we're talking to. You'll notice those that are highlighted in yellow are countries that we have already got agreement that we will work together, and that includes Kenya, who we've just heard about. So Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda are the 4 countries in Africa that we're targeting. Rwanda hasn't yet received its letter, and Uganda we're just waiting to hear back from. In the Americas, it's Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Colombia. And for Colombia, we're just waiting for the results of the election to settle down before we approach them. And then in Asia, it's Pakistan, Vietnam, and India. And Pakistan and Vietnam have already committed to the program. And India, we're just working through some of the questions they have. And those 10 countries between them represent well over 30% of the dairy emissions in the world. The idea behind this is to work with those countries to help them prepare submissions to the Green Climate Fund to receive funding to implement programs in support of the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. And with that, I'm going to just share with you the link to the website where you can go if you want to join Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. It's www.pathways2dairynetzero.org. And at that website, you can find out further information about the initiative. You can also find the details for you to sign up to become a supporter for it as well. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, but I need to stop sharing my screen so that Richard can share his. I'd like to introduce Professor Richard Dewhurst. Richard is the head of Scotland Rural College, the Dairy Research Centre there, and well, my screen's just gone funny on me, and he's based in southwest Scotland. He is the co-chair of the Livestock Research Group of the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, and currently leads a £21 million program, Strength in Places, which is looking at digital dairy value chains for Southwest Scotland and Cumbria. Richard is also helping to guide the research component of the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, which he'll tell us more about today. Richard, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the floor.
Great, thank you very much, Donald, and good morning, everybody. Just if Donald can nod that I can be heard and seen.
Yes, you can.
That's great, thank you very much. As Donald has said, I'm heading the Dairy Research Centre for SIUC based in Scotland. I have a very deep pedigree in dairy, and that just about all of my closest relatives are dairy farmers, and I'm in dairy research. I represent the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, or the GRA, and I'm one of the co-chairs of their livestock group. And that livestock group brings together a number of networks of expertise in areas such as rumen biology, nutrition, genetics, manure management, and animal health, looking at their impacts on livestock greenhouse gas emissions. As Donald has mentioned, GRA is a knowledge partner for the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero programme. We're advising on existing and emerging developing mitigation options, and we're modelling scenarios, particularly focused on scenarios to 2050. And that builds on a considerable body of work conducted by the FAO using their GLEAM modelling techniques, but we're particularly interested to make that more specific to the dairy industry. One of the things that we're looking at is characterising the dairy industry globally. Obviously, with millions of cows and billions of litres around the world, that could be a very big job. What we need to do is characterise the dairy systems of the world at a level that is useful for understanding where emissions are occurring, and particularly understanding the different mitigation options in different typologies around the world. This country level analysis shown in this slide shows the major effect of emissions intensity. On the x-axis, we have kilograms of fat and protein corrected milk per cow per year, and emissions intensity on the y-axis. And you'll note that high productivity is associated with market orientation, and low productivity is often production systems that are for personal use. And that personal use is very important for livelihoods in regions where agroecological settings are the major constraint to milk output. So as Donald has mentioned, we can't just think about a simple equation about milk production and greenhouse gas emissions intensity. We need to look at the wider basket of things that dairy delivers in terms of food and nutrition. Again, taking a very broad sweep and using the previous cutoffs of 1,000 and 4,000 kilograms of fat and protein corrected milk per year, we're able in this slide to compare the share of stock numbers, milk production, and greenhouse gas emissions by system cluster. The low productivity, less than 1,000 kilograms per year, and the high productivity, more than 4,000 kilograms per year. The low productivity systems are often pastoral, agro-pastoral agriculture, nomadic systems in arid regions, for example. The medium productivity systems are really interesting. A lot of milk is produced in this type of system. So this would include many of the smallholder systems around the world, and grazing and pasture dominated systems around the world. A lot of farmers, a lot of cows, but also a lot of potential for reductions in this area. So it's important, as has already been mentioned, that we focus our research and drive to increase the uptake of things that we already know in this particular part of the world, or these particular regions. The high productivity systems, it's interesting to note here that emissions per cow are higher in high productivity cows, just as a consequence of them eating more feed, but they are lower per litre. And as you'll remember from the previous slide, the shape of the previous slide, the benefits of increasing production level, diluting the maintenance cost, and thereby reducing emissions intensity are much less in these high productivity systems. Again, taking a broad brush and just looking at these three broad classes of dairy system. I should say that we're in the process of working to make these descriptions using many more systems. But taking the broad brush, you will see that methane as a percentage of total greenhouse gas emissions tends to decline as productivity increases. Put another way, there's more use of fertilizer and fuels and electricity in the high productivity systems. So thinking a little bit more about dairy system typologies and how we might categorize the dairy systems of the world in a way that is doable but useful in terms of understanding where emissions occur and where mitigation options are best applied. This is one characterization that we've produced, going from the left-hand side with pastoral systems that would typically be in very arid, low gross national income countries, through agropastoral systems where there's more cropping, through smallholder systems that are either specialized livestock or with cropping, through pasture-fed systems, medium-scale specialized, which across the world covers a very wide range of different systems, and we're working to perhaps discriminate that some more, through to the very high input, high output systems, often with confined animals and very, very high feed inputs, often lots of purchased feed inputs, and milk yields in excess of 8,000 kilograms per year. What we need to do is to in our modeling is to be able to allocate these dairy system typologies to the gleam-based spatialization of emissions. So the existing models of emissions are very good in terms of having a spatial representation of systems, but we need to increase the representation of dairy within those models to really get to the bottom of where dairy emissions are occurring and where mitigation is possible. Differences in the level and types of emissions that we've seen described simply in the previous slide, as well as other characteristics of these systems, such as the feed resources used, the use of reproductive technologies, AI, and the ability to feed additives, impact on which mitigations are most suited to the particular system. We have long lists of existing and developing mitigations, just illustrated here. Again, I don't expect you to be able to see all of the detail here, and in fact there's more detail and other mitigation options that may be relevant in certain areas. I would mention feed additives. That obviously depends on the feeding system, whether you're able to incorporate feed additives. The recent developments are beginning to bring to market additives with significant potential to reduce emissions. I'd mentioned feed improvement and health improvement, and the relevance of those depends very much on the starting point of feed quality and health and treatment options in a particular system. And I'd mentioned genetics, and quite a lot of interest around the world in breeding for low emitting animals and developing proxies and indicators for low emitting animals. Obviously, the implementation of that would be accelerated by the use of AI. Just to add a little bit more detail around the three broad types of system I described previously, if we think about low productivity systems where methane is the dominant greenhouse gas emitted in these systems. Show here on the right-hand side of the slide some of the areas that we see as most relevant in the pathway to net zero for this type of system. And you'll see a lot of these are around feeding, improvements in feed quality, and health improvements. That's where we see most potential in these low productivity systems. In the intermediate productivity systems, and remember we've said that there are a lot of cows and a large potential for reductions in emissions from these smallholder and high pasture types of systems. A range of technologies that we see as relevant here. Technologies for methane, which is still an important component of total emissions, but also technologies that are relevant to nitrous oxide, and indeed the use of energy. There's more use of energy in these systems, and therefore more opportunities in this type of system. And thinking about the systems that I'm probably most familiar with myself, the high productivity, high input, high output systems, more potential in these for more technological solutions. So for example, the methane inhibiting feed additives can work really well in situations with very controlled feeding systems. There's great potential for reducing the embedded emissions because there's a lot of imported feed used in some of these systems. So a lot of attention to the emissions that are being brought into the system, and also the breeding solutions, because the rapid advances in reproductive technologies, not just the use of AI, but embryo transfer and in vitro technologies to accelerate the rate of breeding. So just to draw things together, I would say that this is a huge task to characterize dairy emissions and the pathway to net zero. It's an evolving story. We're at a relatively early stage. We are just starting to talk with key countries in Africa and South America and India, which, as Donald has identified, are some of the key areas where there are lots of emissions and lots of potential, but it is a big job that will evolve over time, and we'll add detail as we go. And we see this process as contributing both to the practice and the implementation of technologies that we already know about, but also in guiding future research needs, which are the areas where there's most potential that we should be directing our research dollars at. And with that, I'll thank you all and pass back to Donald.
Donald, you're on mute.
Oh dear, my apologies. Richard, I was just going to say, before we let you go, there was a question that came up for you in the chat function while you were presenting, and it was a question about how are we getting this information about mitigation systems out to those who can implement it, given the success that you're showing in terms of the ability to address climate issues. So what do you think are the best ways that we can start to get this information out to people to implement change in their markets?
I think that the answer to that will be like the emissions profiles and the mitigation options will vary by regions around the world. If I think about developed countries and think about the track of my career, early in my career, we had large extension and advisory services funded by government that promoted lots of things, but unfortunately we don't have those kind of structures now. I think, and I would say in the current climate, that actually the dairy processors are in an exceptionally strong position to drive change, and that's something that we're seeing in the UK. They're really well placed to, to work with their farmer producers and advise and encourage, that combination, the carrot and the stick kind of approach.
Thank you. Thank you. Richard, would you just take one moment to maybe share with people a little background on GRA as well? I don't know that you really covered who the GRA is in your introduction. I certainly didn't introduce it as such.
Yeah, so the GRA is a grouping that brings together expertise on agricultural greenhouse gases across the world. The level that I'm working at is mostly focused on livestock greenhouse gases. We have a livestock research group, and that is made up of 5 networks. There's a network about rumen microbiome and very much focused on methane. There's one that's very much focused on feeding and nutrition, one that's focused on animal breeding and developing proxies and breeding for low emitting animals, one that's focused on manure management and one that's looking at animal health and the relationship between animal health, treatment and disease and emissions intensity. So that's the livestock research group. It's researchers from across the world, bringing them together to share experience, often centered around major international projects in different areas. Sometimes it's a European Union type of project, but other big projects that give those networks a core. Beyond livestock, and this is the bit that I'm less clear about, there is another research group that's interested in croplands, and yet another that's looking at rice, and there's also an integrated research group. There's a danger that we look at crops and livestock and separately and don't think holistically enough. So an integrative research group that has a particular focus around the inventories and NDCs and that kind of area across different sectors.
Yeah, look, that's fantastic. Look, thank you so much, Richard, for your presentation today. It's always a pleasure to see you, and we really appreciate the work that is going on within GRA. I just encourage those of us who are attending the meeting today to think about the questions you might have for our speakers and to put those either in the Q&A function or in the chat. And I, as moderator, will do my best to raise those with speakers as we go along. And I just want to recognize that in our participants today, we've got some really senior representatives from some of the country missions around the world, many of them involved in the climate change discussion. So thank you for your participation today. With that, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Brian Lindsey. Brian is UK based, although I think he just flew back from Australia last night, Brian. So hopefully the jet lag hasn't kicked in just yet. He holds the post of Director of the Dairy Sustainability Framework on behalf of the dairy industry. And he also acts as Global Dairy Platform's sector lead for sustainability and is currently a board member of the Dairy Asia Initiative, which sits under the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock being run through the FAO. Brian's going to be speaking to us today about the Dairy Sustainability Framework and how it's the beginning of the global dairy sector's sustainability journey. So Brian, thank you very much for your presentation, and I look forward to listening to you.
Thank you, Donald. Can I just check you're seeing slides and hearing?
Yes, we are.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to come and share with you a bit more about the Dairy Sustainability Framework today. And I suppose the main message today is how all the different groups work together. And that's one thing we have as a unique industry like dairy. We do talk together, we do work together to achieve a common goal. And I think, it's an incredible opportunity we have to make a difference. And I always say in other meetings I'm in, dairy is quite unique. And Richard just mentioned there about getting messages out to farmers and those who are really implementing it at the coalface, that we have an opportunity to do that. And we have daily contact with our customer as a dairy farmer. Other industries don't have that. And I think that's where we're quite unique in being able to have that relationship between the dairy farmer and their processor in order to make change and accelerate change at scale, which is what we really need to do. And that's the whole purpose of all the work we're doing. As Donald rightly said, I'm the director of the Dairy Sustainability Framework, and the whole purpose of the Dairy Sustainability Framework is about monitoring and reporting our progress as a global dairy sector in an aggregate way and how we're performing with sustainability, focusing on a continuous improvement approach. We're working in biological systems, as Richard's just really well explained, in terms of nothing happens overnight. So we measure things over time. We look at continuous improvement. And the DSF has been set up to do that, because unless we're monitoring how we're going, we're doing lots of great stuff, we're getting nice warm feelings in our heart, but we don't know whether we're making a difference or not. So the important thing as a sector is to aggregately report in an aggregate way and monitor how we're progressing. Dairy is diverse, as Donald and Richard just said, and the DSF is no different to that. It's a framework. It's not trying to be a certification scheme or a standard. It's about having everyone in the tent. So it doesn't matter the size of your production system, whether you started your sustainability journey 3 years ago, 10 years ago, or you're just starting today. There's a place for you in the dairy sustainability tent. And I think that's where dairy is quite unique, in that it is encompassing and it has everyone in the tent, and we work together in a pre-competitive way. As I've just said, we focus on continuous improvement as opposed to a point-in-time reporting. And what we're trying to do is get global alignment. Both Donald and Richard have talked about helping those who are in emerging dairy economies, learning from the experiences of those in the more developed economies. How do we get that global alignment? How do we come up with our level of understanding and get closer together? We're connecting our members. It's pre-competitive. We encourage our colleagues to talk to each other, share solutions to common problems, and we're quantifying that progress across the whole value chain. And we want to be seen as a responsible sector, because we know we produce fantastic nutrition. It's accessible, but we are challenged in terms of environment and other sustainability criteria. The important thing about the DSF, it has 11 sustainability criteria that were developed as a result of a major global study we did just prior to the development of the DSF in 2013. It has 6 environment, 2 economic, and 3 social criteria. And Richard and Donald again talked about not looking at things in silos. Though we've got them in silos here, what we do recognize as a dairy community is the interaction between those different criteria. And the other unique thing about the DSF is that it covers the whole dairy value chain. So many of the initiatives out there globally are focused on the farm. Yes, the farm is where a major part of our challenges are, but all along the value chain, there are contributions that can be made by the dairy sector to improve SDG delivery and also reduce our impacts, whether they be on the environment, whether they economically or socially. Just as a bit of background, Donald talked about having 242 billion litres of milk as in our membership of DSF. Actually, that grew by 9.7 billion litres in 2020 alone. So that just shows how we're growing and bringing others into the sustainability tent, so we can all move together forward together. Now, it's important that we also don't just focus on the number of litres, but we focus on a number of other pieces of information that help us understand how we can better support the dairy sector in the journey. So on one hand, we're actually reporting and monitoring, but on the other hand, that reporting and monitoring helps us make informed decisions as a dairy sector about where we need to go in the future with further research, further support, and ask questions, why aren't we making more progress in these areas? Without this data, it doesn't allow us to do that. Coming back to the SDGs, several years ago, we worked with Rabobank, looking at the 17 SDGs. Each one of those sections of the pie chart there is the individual SDGs. In the grey column in the left-hand side of your screen, you see all of the DSF criteria. And if you look at that pie chart in the middle, everywhere you see writing and a symbol in the outside section of that pie chart is everywhere where dairy, using the Dairy Sustainability Framework only, is having an impact on each of the 17 SDGs. The areas where there's gaps, and there's 2 of those there, They are areas that other parts of the dairy industry are working on, not the DSF. So this pie chart's all about the DSF, but what it just drives home is how important dairy is and the role we have in supporting the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's not just about environment, it's not just about water or emissions, it's about the integrated approach of dairy and how much it can deliver the necessary outcomes of the Sustainable Development Goals. So our members are fully aware of this. So they're doing great work and we're monitoring and reporting our progress, but at the same time, we're recognizing our contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And as Donald said, we bring out an annual report. And to deliver that annual report for each of the 11 sustainability criteria we have, we've developed a number, and one per criteria, a number of indicators that allow us to track progress. And I'm just going to spend some time with you now sharing how that's going. We're owned by the dairy industry, the DSF. So what we have is a multi-stakeholder advisory council. We're given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, I believe. We've got to do more listening. So we get this group together, the DSF Advisory Council, several times a year to advise us, challenge us, look at the direction we're traveling and help us understand where the dairy sector might need to change in the future and where it might need to make more effort. But this group were also instrumental in helping us develop our indicators to be able to track our progress. We did a 2-year project with the University of Arkansas, taking us through a science-based approach that went through in external consultations on developing each of the indicators for the 11 criteria. And that enables us to pull reports together. And if we look at the report on how members communicate with their members, and this is an economic criteria. In 2019, 78% of the members who prioritized this criteria, because each member goes through the 11 and prioritizes which ones they're going to focus on, 78% in 2019 had a method of communicating with their farmers about market opportunities, how they might be able to enhance those, moving to 2020 to 89% with the same level of membership, prioritizing that. You'll see under the title at the top there, we have the bit in blue. That's called the strategic intent. This is what the dairy sector globally, if they prioritize this criteria, are working towards. So in different parts of the world, they'll have different improvement programs, but they're all focused on delivering and achieving this bit in blue at the top. It's about making sure we're focusing, and that's how we get the alignment. If we have a look at the next one. So here again, if I can just move my screen here, for soil nutrients, okay, and environmental criteria, the strategic intent, well, if you've prioritized this globally, you're working towards making sure that nutrient application is managed to minimize impact on water and air whilst maintaining and enhancing soil quality. So how do we go in 2019 to 2020? And this is part of our reporting. In 2019, we had 328,000 farms prioritizing this globally. And 12.4% of those farms were implementing what we see as the indicator for this criteria, and that's implementing a soil quality management plan. So 12.4% of those 328 farms were implementing soil management quality plans. Moving to 2020, we had 12.3%, but what also happened over that year is that we had an additional 41,500 farms prioritize that criteria. So we're having to re-baseline each year. But this gives us an idea on how we're performing globally. If we didn't have this, we'd be making thumb in the air type judgments and designing projects on what we think was right. Here we're getting hard data that we're able to make informed decisions on. And then if we look at the next one, which is in the social pillar on working conditions, and here we're talking about across the dairy value chain, workers operate in a safe environment and their rights are respected. So if you're working in Latin America or Europe, you're aiming to achieve this same outcome, regardless of what your program looks like. In 2019, we had 255,500 farms prioritizing this. And the indicator for this one is about having implementing safety plans on those farms. 57.2% at the beginning of 2019 had those safety plans. But then during 2019, those same farms, we increased that by 12.2%. So we're able to see the progress. But then also in that year, another 44,000 farms prioritized. So we re-baseline, and we're sitting at 64,500% of those farms now having safety plans. We're understanding where we're tracking. And coming back to the question that Jackie asked in the chat, The DSF is also about sharing information. We're pre-competitive. We bring our members together. We build platforms that enable them to share that information and solve challenges that they find that are very similar, regardless of where they're farming or milk processing in the world. So we bring our members together. We encourage them to share that information to get the better alignment, but actually importantly, enables us to move forward faster. Just another piece of work we're doing at the moment, funded by Global Dairy Platform and the International Fund for Agricultural Development. It's looking at the DSF in the more emerging dairy regions. And I won't ask you to say which flags these countries represent, but we're in Vietnam at the top left-hand side, we're working with Vinamilk. In India, we're working with Amul. In Rwanda, we're working with Inyange Industries. And in Kenya, Donald said Kenya would be mentioned a bit, we're working with Palmhouse Dairies. These organizations are showing real leadership in those regions and implementing the DSF, and we're learning from that experience. I said earlier that each of the members of the DSF prioritize which of the 11 criteria they're going to work on. They've been through a process of identifying which are the important criteria to us in our unique situation, geography, marketplace, and so forth. Vinamilk are working on product safety and quality, working conditions, rural economies. In India, they're focusing on greenhouse gas emissions and rural economies. In Yange, we're in the middle of their materiality. We're looking at we're doing the priority setting right now. In fact, we've got a meeting next week to go through the outcomes of the stakeholder survey they've done that involves customers, farmers, government organizations, academia, to try and understand what are the priorities that need to be done. And in Kenya, we're working on soils and the working conditions. So each area is different. Across the globe, we're actually covering all. The DSF also publishes lots of documents, and even with other organizations, the International Dairy Federation, life cycle assessment work, and other publications to help members move forward. In terms of pathways to dairy net zero, the DSF is looking at how we can support the FAO, taking all this data we're getting data from 32% of global dairy. How can we help that feed into the GLEAN model to have more accurate and more up-to-date data? And that's part of our role in the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero challenge, and we're going to fulfill that as best we can. We're looking at what is the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements that would enable our members' data to be used so we can make better decisions and move forward faster. Mr. Chairman, I know I'm over time. There's our dairy members of the Dairy Sustainability Framework, and anybody who wants to know more can find us at dairysustainabilityframework.org. Thank you, Donald.
Thank you very much, Brian. We are a little over time, so we're going to keep moving at this stage. Again, I would encourage you all to consider questions you might have for any of our speakers today. But we're going to shift gears and move along now to our next speaker, Celeste Leroux, who will provide an overview of the Dairy Nourishes Africa initiative. Celeste is a senior manager at Bain & Company, focused on building inclusive, resilient food systems in Africa. She's currently responsible for leading Bain's participation in Dairy Nourishes Africa alongside the Global Dairy Platform and Land O'Lakes Venture 37. Celeste has developed case studies on agricultural enterprises across Africa for Bain's 2020 report, How Farmer-Allied Intermediaries Can Transform Africa's Food Systems. I'm going to pop a link in the chat to that report because I think it's a particularly useful document for people to see. And that supported the creation of a coalition for farmer-allied intermediaries among Bain, TechnoServe, Partners in Food Solutions, Land O'Lakes Venture 37, Root Capital, and the US African Development Bank. Celeste holds a Master's of International Business with a focus on development economics from the Fletcher School, Tufts University. And with that, Celeste, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much, Donald. I'll try to keep this rather brief and really focused on our work, particularly in East Africa, as I think we've heard throughout the opening comments and the other speakers as well about the critical importance of dairy in advancing the SDGs and give you a bit of the on-the-ground examples. The focus today will be to talk about Dairy Nourishes Africa, which, as Donald has mentioned, is a long-term public-private partnership conceived by the Global Dairy Platform to help transform dairy sectors in East Africa. And then was joined by Bain & Company and the Land O'Lakes Venture 37, which has over 40 years experience implementing agricultural development projects to further develop the program, and now we implement together on the ground. So I think in the opening remarks and also from Mr. Masila, we really heard about the critical importance that dairy plays in East Africa. A few of the key benefits highlighted on this page, and just to provide you with a little bit of further context in the landscape that we are working in, I'll just share a few statistics. So on the bottom left around accelerating climate mitigation, as we know, agriculture is the largest source of GHG emissions, but the dairy sector intensity in East Africa in particular, which is one of the less developed dairy systems, is about 5 to 10 times the global average. So driving climate smart agricultural practice is particularly important, and we'll look at how that productivity is such an important lever that we focus on. In terms of nutrition, animal source foods and dairy in particular can make a huge difference. In East Africa, over 30% of children are stunted due to inadequate nutrition, and current dairy consumption is only around 20 to 50% of the World Health Organization's recommended amount, with Kenya actually consuming the most, around 110 liters per capita per year, and in Tanzania, where we focus a lot of our work, being second at around 50 liters per year. There are also benefits around improving livelihoods. As we know, agriculture is a key sector for employment, and as we heard in the opening remarks, dairy in particular being one. However, the industry is challenged with low productivity, both on the farms, but then when you move into the dairy processors, their capacity utilization is often below 50% due to this lack of supply. And also worth noting the big role that it can play to enhance women and youth inclusion. Similar to the global statistics shared, women do make up about 70% of dairy jobs, but similar to youth, often lack access to the additional skills and resources to take their enterprises further. So today we'll share a bit about how DNA works to address these challenges in the dairy sector. And while there have been many dairy development projects, traditionally there's been a lot of focus on the farmer side, which is absolutely needed. What we're doing is we're shifting the locus of focus a bit further up the value chain, and we work specifically with and through dairy processors. The reason we do this is because they provide a critical anchor in the value chain, both by providing the consistent demand and offtake from the farmers that incentivize them to invest in their dairy enterprises, and being the producers of nutritious, affordable dairy products for consumers. It's not just any enterprise, though, that we are looking for. We particularly focus on what we call farmer-allied enterprises, and this is further expanded upon in the report that Donald will share. But what that means is these are businesses that intentionally and strategically source from smallholder farmers and invest in strengthening their capacity. And they do so by either providing or facilitating access to technical assistance, helping provide access to quality inputs, and also the financing needed to purchase those inputs. And they, as I mentioned, provide that guaranteed offtake for the farmers that are investing in their farm enterprises, that they know they have a market to sell to. And some of them even pay a premium for quality milk in particular. So this is our theory of change, and it's really translated into our strategic framework. And this is how we operationalize it. We take a market-led systems approach, meaning that we work across the value chain as well as in the operating environment. So as you can see in this graphic, we put the dairy enterprises really at the center of our work, but we do also work upstream on farmer production, and I'll share more specific examples as we go on, as well as driving consumer demand in these countries. In the operating environment, we also focus on increasing the ability and resources to focus on the safety and quality of the products. We look to increase access to capital. And we look also at building data, just building data, to be honest. There is a lot of data out there, but there isn't always very robust consolidation of this data. And there's also great gaps in knowledge and understanding. So building data and providing that as a resource for the industry, which links also to industry advocacy, showing what works and what doesn't work, really sharing lessons learned. In 2020, we piloted in Tanzania, and today's the examples will be very much focused on that initial pilot and the results that we achieved. But we have also activated in Kenya, working with a medium-sized farmer allied dairy processor in Nyeri County earlier this year. And we have just embarked on a 3-year partnership called the Tanzania Inclusive Producer Processor Partnership, which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and implemented through the Tanzania Agricultural Development Bank, with DNA as one of the key implementing partners of this long-term effort. Our ambition, as it says here, is to transform African dairy industries by creating vibrant ecosystems of farmer-allied and environmentally sustainable enterprises that improve nutrition, enhance livelihoods, and stimulate economic growth. So I'll share a few highlights on how we've done this to date. In terms of our interventions, and particularly relevant to this conversation, which not only focuses on the SDGs, but also on the impact in the wake of COVID. When we piloted in Tanzania in 2020, it really was, in the wake of that first wave of COVID, and we worked with a medium-sized business in the north of Tanzania, as well as a smaller woman-owned dairy enterprise in the southern part of Tanzania. And they were both really challenged by the impact of COVID, during which many of the HoReCa sector, hotel, restaurants, catering, had actually slowed down or shut down, and not being able to move their products in markets. So what we worked with them on is a few different things. And one in particular was enhancing how they actually access markets and how they shift those different channels. In the region, the cold chain is a significant challenge as well. So we tried different innovations. You see a picture there of some mobile sales. There are also different branded point of sale fridges put in, and going to customers a bit more directly, and also changing the product mixes to what customers can and want to buy, particularly in COVID-19 when incomes were also strained. Beyond that specific COVID response, we do work on broader behavior change and market research campaigns. And we also have been piloting different sustainable models for school milk promotion to help address the longer term nutrition challenges, as well as those build dairy consumers of the future. And what we've been doing there is innovating around different models of parent-funded school milk that can complement subsidized models of school milk and offer a more financially sustainable route to spreading that nutrition across the country. On the enterprises themselves, this is where Bain largely brings our classic approach. As we would work with very large businesses on their commercial strategies, we offer the same services to these dairy processors, and we really help them develop multi-year actionable roadmaps for growth to put them on the path to more profitable and scalable growth. We also offer them best-in-class technical expertise through the Global Dairy Platform, where member companies offer their volunteers depending on what the specific needs of the businesses are. We've helped them enhance product mix formulations, planned layouts. And so as we go along, we do have this great access through GDP to a wealth of expertise and people who are willing to lend their time to this effort. And we facilitate access to finance, both with our own funding for DNA, where we use matching grants, and which can often be very catalytic in helping these enterprises take their growth to the next level, and through linkages to other financial institutions. And on the farmer side, this is where our partners Venture 37 lead very much. We enhance the processor extension services, and what we call an embedded extension model, where these farmer allied enterprises actually employ their own extension officers. And there's a good business case to doing so, and we've been building evidence over time, given the low productivity and the need for increased quantities of quality milk. The economics really do play out for the businesses to invest on the farmer level. So while they employ some extension officers and do training, they also link to other service providers in the area for access to inputs, particularly AI services, forage seeds, and such. And this ultimately also helps enhance the raw milk quality. We'll share a bit of the results coming from this work, but before we do, we want to just emphasize that DNA is party to the dairy industry's global net zero commitment. And our current focus, and I think as we could see through the other presentations, the critical importance of productivity to reducing emissions intensity really as a primary lever. That is where our focus has been to date. On the left-hand side, and I think we all know the big contribution that agriculture makes to emissions, it's very important in the East African context as well. And the countries themselves have very admirable commitments to mitigation. And we're hoping that we can, through driving this dairy sector development, make a meaningful contribution to reaching those goals. So on the right, as you see, our starting point really is how do we drive productivity on the farm level. We also do focus on manure, water, and soil management and mitigating emissions from feeds. Looking ahead, we will look further at other climate resilient activities as well, between fodder crop technologies, conservation, and animal husbandry technologies as well. In terms of impact, there's quite a few numbers on this page, but I'll just focus on a few. On the demand side, helping these businesses, particularly in the wake of COVID, really makes a difference in terms of their revenue. And we actually saw new channels that came online start being primary revenue drivers for these businesses, with contributing 50% through new direct-to-customer channels or 3x increase in customer order size. But also interestingly, with the parent-paid school milk programs, we saw 40% of parents reporting that their children were now starting to consume dairy as part of their school meal, compared to only 2% when we actually baselined this program. The two dairy enterprises we worked with in the middle of the page have seen strong growth, 130% year-on-year revenue growth, and the other one doubling their annual revenue. And as I mentioned, with that linkage through GDP, it also helped them enhance their product recipes and mixes. On the farmer side, and particularly related to the climate smart approach here, we were able to drive the milk acceptance rate up, which also is beneficial in terms of reducing food loss. So we went from about a 93% acceptance rate of milk at the processor to a 98 to 100% acceptance rate. Overall, over a 9-month pilot, we were able to achieve a 5.5 liter increase per cow per day. And this directly translates to increased income for these smallholder farmers and the lives that depend on them, about a 57% increase in farmer incomes, and a 33% reduction in on-farm GHG emission intensity. This was amongst about 800 farmers during a 9-month pilot, and now we're hoping with this 3-year runway that we have in Tanzania to build on this and significantly scale this impact. It's also worth noting at the bottom, in addition to working with these processors directly, we did equip 65 other processors with a COVID response and recovery playbook, similar to what we would present to our GDP members in the dairy sector as well. And we've been engaging the different government and industry bodies and sharing these lessons learned, such as the business case for an embedded extension model, or the different models of school milk, which can help increase both nutrition, but also is another outlet for the dairy processors in terms of driving their utilization. Bringing this beyond numbers a little bit more to life in terms of what this means. On the left, it's worth noting that we are very much on the school milk side collaborating with the Ministry of Livestock and the Tanzania Dairy Board to not only turn on those specific programs, but also share these benefits and broader campaigns towards increased consumption of dairy. We do measure ourselves against the DSF as well in terms of GHG emissions, market development, and rural economies. And there's a nice quote in the top right, orange there, from Anati, the CEO of Sebadom, in terms of the impact that we've been able to have in really taking their business up a notch and professionalizing it and setting them up for growth. I won't go through all the SDGs that we are touching, but we like to say about 8 of the 17 we are able to directly impact. And I think the one that we just haven't focused as much on in this conversation so far is number 17, the partnerships for the goals as well. DNA really, particularly as we turn on out further in Tanzania in partnership directly with the government and also the private sector, is a great example of how public-private partnerships and multi-stakeholder forums can drive change. So I'll just end with saying that we do have bold ambitions for continuing to help support the development of dairy sector in East Africa. We are, as I mentioned, in Tanzania. We have been working in Kenya, and we do hope to expand throughout the region. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Celeste, for your leadership in terms of the Dairy Nourishes Africa program. We're running a little behind time, so we're going to move quickly to Gina Gutierrez. Gina is a dairy farmer from Mexico, a fifth-generation dairy farmer, in fact, in the central highlands of Mexico. She's been managing the family dairy farm since she graduated in 2008. Gina is also a community outreach advocate for the Global Farmer Network, as well as being one of Global Dairy Platform's dairy ambassadors. And she's here to share her perspective on dairy's efforts to achieve the SDGs. Gina, over to you.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone from Mexico. I've been moving around since the sun started to rise up over here. But I want to make some remarks because we've been through more than 2 years of uncertainty because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But for us dairy farmers, that's nothing. We have dealt with uncertainty our whole lives. COVID just makes things a little bit more difficult for us. But just like health and emergency services across the world, farming never stopped. Frontline responders were there, working to save our lives, because that's what they do. They're heroes who deserve a recognition, respect, and gratitude. But even heroes had to stop and eat. And just like me, millions of farmers around the world kept on working to feed the world that now must recover and build back. And we're already leading the way, because if anyone knows about resilience, it's dairy farmers. More than 6 billion people consume the milk we'll produce, because it is an affordable and nutritious food that is always there. Because one thing is certain, we farm every day. We never stop because we're proud to contribute to have more resilient and sustainable food systems. I am a fifth generation, just like Donald just said. My family has been adapting to ever-changing circumstances for over 100 years. Innovations, new technologies, and sustainable farming practices have been part of our story, allowing us to take care of our employees, our communities, our cows, and natural resources. Farming today is not the same it was 10 years ago, and certainly not the same as the past 100 years. And now we have tools that build a common language like the Dairy Sustainability Framework. And we have also embraced pathways to dairy net zero because we are committed to raise our common ambitions to keep providing high quality protein for all. And even though we have improved and have been working sustainably for many, many years, these kind of initiatives allow us to have certainty about what more we need to do and how we can work together to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm fifth generation, but I'm actually the first female farmer in my family. Before me, my mom and other women in my family married farmers. I am the farmer. And like myself, 80 million women take part in dairy farming, and 37 million farms in the world are managed by women. There are still opportunities and issues to change, but there is a way for us to feel and be empowered as livestock owners and processors. Dairy farming is a source of stable income for us, providing year-round cash flow. And when women own dairy cattle, we have property of our own, giving us more power over our lives and influence over certain expenditures, boosting our social and economic capital, while strengthening our decision-making power and also capabilities. Women in dairy are also caregivers because we provide nutrition to our households and our communities. As we know, a better nourished community will contribute to have a better development and poverty reduction. And dairy is a way to break the cycle of poverty, and women in dairy play a key role in achieving it. And it's not just in developing countries. Dairy farming is also important in the developed world, because no matter where we are, dairy provides sustainable livelihoods and revigorates rural economies. As we heard before, Dairy Nourishes Africa is a good example of what dairy can achieve when we build together, incorporating an approach on the full value chain. Projects like these are an example of how we can address these issues that worry us all, like hunger, malnutrition, or livelihoods, for them to be more equitable, especially for women and girls and our environment. There is a way to deliver social, nutritional, economical, and environmental imperatives for sustainable growth. Farmers like me have been working tirelessly for generations to provide food for all, to protect our ecosystems and provide stable livelihoods. We make sure to use natural resources in a responsible way. And we even do more because our cows upcycle many byproducts that otherwise would be polluting our environment because there would be no other use for them. Our livestock is amazing. In exchange for good care, they provide us with milk. How amazing is that? Dairy farmers like myself want our food systems to be more resilient, inclusive, and environmentally sustainable, and we're on it. Please be assured that we're working hard to do it. It's time to recover and build back better. We know that shocks like the pandemic can do to our food systems, but please trust us. We're working hard to be better every day, as we have been doing for the past 100 years and more. We will continue to provide safe and affordable nutrition every day for everyone, no matter what our circumstances are. So as a farmer, I would just like to say thank you to the Dairy Sustainability Framework, to the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, for Dairy Nourishes Africa to show us how we can achieve better things together. Thank you to Global Dairy Platform, and thank you for having me today. Please support farmers. We're doing our best.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gina. Quite an inspirational statement for closing today. And if we could just have all of the panelists on the screen momentarily. We don't have a lot of time left, and I do have just one or two questions that had come through in the chat function that I'd like to share. So if we could have Richard and Brian as well, please, and Celeste. There's Celeste. Celeste, let's start with you just while we're waiting for everyone. I know Brian has somewhat answered this question in the chat, but there was a question about, when agriculture is mentioned in NDCs in particular, it's mainly in the context of cropping, etc., with little attention to livestock or dairy in particular. How do you think we can use the work that's going on in programs like Dairy Nourishes Africa to influence the attitude towards livestock in nationally determined commitments to make sure that the sector is being well represented? And I know, Brian, you've contributed somewhat in the chat function to this, but Celeste, if you wouldn't mind just giving your thoughts, please.
Of course. I mean, from an on-the-ground perspective, how we try to do this is really engaging directly with the relevant ministries and industry bodies themselves, particularly in Tanzania. So as I mentioned, we're working with the Tanzanian Agricultural Development Bank, but we also stay close to the Ministry of Livestock and Fisheries, the Tanzania Dairy Board, and also the Tampa and Tambura, the relevant industry bodies. And by having those regular touch points to share the impact and also share the quantification of really how you can have an impact, for example, on reducing emissions intensity, that does seem to get filtered back. Now, how it then translates into direct policy, that is a focus that we want to continue to have, and I think that's where Brian's input is particularly helpful. And also, as you mentioned, Donald, the concept note even that we're working on in collaboration towards GCF, so really showing what role dairy is going to play and continues to play in taking this forward. But we always welcome feedback. On the Kenyan side, it's a bit more with the Agricultural Transformation Office to date.
Fantastic, thank you. Brian, last question is going to go to you, and it's really, it came through in a couple of comments. How do we do more with NGOs? I know you've got a number of NGOs who are part of your panel within the Dairy Sustainability Framework, your advisory committee, but how do we do more work with NGOs to demonstrate the commitment that the dairy sector has to sustainability?
Yeah, interesting one, Donald. I think we've come a long way with working with NGOs, and I think they've matured as well as us in the way we work together. And I think what we've identified is that we're all going for the same goals, and collaboration is key to make you get there. And I think our experience in the DSF and the work we've been doing with GDP, especially in the UNFCCC climate discussions, it's about letting them know you're genuine you're serious about what you're doing, and you're transparent. And it's absolutely key. You build the relationship. We're all striving for the same goals. If they see you are making a genuine effort to make a difference, as we are as dairy, they will come with us and they will support us. And we have had quite a unique experience in the DSF this year, where we're starting some new projects, and those NGOs on our advisory council now want to be part of our projects. They haven't been in the past. They wanted to monitor, but now they want to be part of what we're doing because they see we're genuine and we're trying to make a difference.
I think a statement that I've heard several times recently, it's about progress, not perfection. And I think that's important, and certainly came through in comments that were made by others. My apologies, we are out of time. I would particularly like to thank His Excellency from Botswana for his pre-recorded comments. Also, Mr. Masela from the Ministry of the Permanent Mission of Kenya to the UN, both of those governments for sharing their comments with us this morning, and indeed the leadership that they play within the UN in terms of promoting livestock as well. I would be terribly remiss not to thank Richard for a great presentation this morning, Richard, in terms of the research that's going on. So thank you for that, sir. Brian, Dairy Sustainability Framework. I'm looking forward to the day when we can tell people that we've got over 50% of the world's dairy production reporting through the framework. So no pressure there, Brian. Celeste, the fantastic work that's going on within Dairy Nourishes Africa. I thank you and the team at Bain and Venture 37 for the commitment and indeed the progress that's being made. And I did put a note in the chat function for people so they could get a link to the Farmer Allied intermediary work that you've been leading within Bain and Co. And Gina, what an inspirational set of comments on behalf of dairy farmers all over the world. And indeed, without being disrespectful, Gina, I think you represent a younger group than the rest of us on this call. And it gives me great heart to know that the dairy sector is in such wonderful hands going forward. So thank you for that. In closing, I just want to share a couple of quick comments. Dairy is a force for good in the world. We know the value that dairy brings from a nutritional perspective, livelihoods, economic growth, women's empowerment. We've covered all those issues today. But we also acknowledge and recognize that dairy, like all agricultural commodities, can do and must do more in terms of its environmental performance and impact it has on natural resource usage. And through the work that you've heard about today, whether it's the Dairy Sustainability Framework, the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, or indeed the Dairy Nourishes Africa program, I hope you've seen the commitment that dairy has made to tackling greenhouse gas emissions, to tackling other elements of sustainability, to tackling issues to do with nutritional security around the world. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all today. I would like to just recognize and acknowledge some of the audience members that we've had. We've had representatives from Mozambique, China, Colombia, Botswana, Canada, Kenya, United States, better say Scotland to cover Richard off, but from many, many different parts of the world in attendance at today's meeting. And I thank you all for that. We also had some sector leaders, the Director General of the International Dairy Federation, as well as a number of very senior people from Dairy Farms America, Danone, and other organizations as well. So I thank you all for your participation today. Today's meeting will be recorded, and you will have an opportunity to share the recording with your colleagues and friends as well. With that, I thank everyone for their participation today. I imagine most of us are now going to go and join the HLPF to see the SOFI report launched, and I would encourage you all to do so. In the meantime, take care, and best of wishes from all of us. Thank you.